Recording now.
Okay.
So,
Well, let's see. Back it up. Okay, do you want to tell us about, first of all, where were you born?
I was born in Blooming Prairie, Minnesota in February 22nd, 1919.
okay.
And when was Dad born, and where was Dad born?
Oh, Bob was born on October 20th, 1918.
Where at?
And
In
he was
1918, so he was a year,
Austin, Minnesota. Austin, Minnesota, he was
Okay.
born.
so he was a year older than you.
No, just about 6 months.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Only 6 months.
And when did you and Dad first meet?
Oh, he sat in front of me in the 8th grade. Dad
Really?
did. He did.
That was the first that you knew of him? Did you like him when you first saw him, or what was your impression of him?
Dude, he was just like any other boy in the room. Didn't
You didn't think
nothing.
he was cute, or
No.
Or goofy.
he didn't make an impression on you at all?
What?
He didn't impress, you weren't going, wow, this guy was just another
No, I
kid
just
who-
thought he was a nice person.
Yeah.
Now, what about your family? Your mom and your dad.
My dad. Let's see. He was born. I forget the year he was born.
That's
Doesn't
okay,
matter.
we can always
It's all right. It's okay.
It doesn't matter.
No.
Okay.
Yeah, don't worry about that.
Anyway, when my dad was born, was about 12 years old. His family was broken up, and he virtually almost became an orphan
Right.
because his mother got sick. One of his she expected a baby, and it was twins, and she wanted a little girl so bad, and the little girl died, and she kind of lost her mind over that. Well, as a result, then my dad and his two brothers were just shunted around, from whoever would take them in, and
So her
finally
breakdown
my
broke up the family.
Huh?
Her breakdown broke up the family then.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and it was, she was angry at my grandfather because he was in a bar at the time.
Oh, yeah, that would do it, yeah.
That's right, and so that really upset her. Anyway,
Did it break up their marriage as a result of it, or did they?
Yes.
Did he live, or?
yes, she lost her mind over it, and so, anyway, then the children were, my dad was on his own from the time he was 12 years old, really. He
Wow.
went out working and he ended up working for somebody that ran a creamery. And through this man, he learned the buttermaker's trade.
Okay.
And he finally ended up in, I think it was Medford, Minnesota. And in Medford, my uncle and aunt lived there, and my mother came to visit there. And she met him. He was running the creamery there at Medford, Minnesota.
Okay.
Okay? And then,
What sort of education did your mother have, or what was her background?
my mother and father, neither one of them went much more than the 4th grade in school.
Really?
Fourth
Both
or
your
fifth.
mother and father?
4th or 5th grade of school. They didn't, in those days, they didn't go to school, a lot of them. And that was just the opposite of Bob's parents. Bob's parents, both of them, were college graduates, and
Oh
that
my
was
God.
something unheard of. Yes, and Grandpa Duffy, he was a very well-educated man. He could have had a job any place he wanted, but what did he do? He ended up, he didn't really have that much of ambition, if you want to know the truth. He was a
That's what you're here
policeman.
for.
And a policeman, he was tough as nails. Whenever they had a case or had somebody they wanted to round up, get Joe Duffy. Joe Duffy will get him, and as a result, one time there was a drunken Indian in a bar, and he was trying to bring him in, and came up behind him and hit him on the back of the head and the neck, And that, as a result of that, Bob's dad had epilepsy. It caused him to, you know,
To have convulsions?
yeah.
To have convulsions?
Yes,
And
he'd
seizures?
have convulsions all the time. And in those days, they didn't have such a thing that would, you know, medication like they do now if you have a, and so he never could hold down a job after that. Different people gave him a chance, you know, and he never knew when he'd had one of those spells. And he would never go to mass or church with any of the family. He'd get up real early and go alone because he's afraid he'd have an attack and then embarrass the family. And anyway, he had those, he never knew when one of those spells were going to come on. And he, just like that, he'd let out a scream and he'd fall.
Oh. Did you ever
And-
see him have one?
Huh?
Did you ever see him
Oh,
have one?
no, he didn't, when I'd go over there to visit, he wouldn't show up very much. It was like he was afraid something would happen. He never knew when he was going to have one of those, one
Wow.
of those spells. And so,
What was your impression of him as a man? Did you find him to be an angry man? Like when you first met him, were you intimidated by him, or did you just feel he was sort of a sad figure?
I just felt sorry, awful sorry for him, but I never really knew him that well because he would he had a room off the kitchen and he just kind of would hide in, you know, go in there and stay. And they even, to get him to, he kind of got into a fit of depression over that because he couldn't hold down a job. And they took and they committed him just to have him snap out of it. But it didn't snap him out of it, or else they found it, and they took him back home. And then they,
Did they give him shock treatments and stuff? in there?
something, yeah, they tried to help him.
Oh, sounds like, yeah.
Well, then they added on to their,
Can we just pause
onto
it?
their house.
Yeah, sorry, Mom. That's
What?
Leave it to my mother. Oh, now that we just got you going across the screen, that's all. Just
I didn't know you did. So, basically, can you where are we at with Mom? She was talking about.
Oh, yeah.
well, we've been talking about
Can you
your grandpa
replay it
Duffy.
a little bit at all?
No.
I could, but it would take time to
Well,
get back.
I'll tell you this, he was
Is
a
it on now?
wonderful, brilliant man. They even tried to have a little neighborhood grocery store attached to their house so he'd have
This
a
is
job.
Mr. Duffy, Joe Duffy.
I'm talking about Grandpa Joe Duffy. His name was Michael Joseph Duffy, but everybody called him Joe. And he'd have those spells, and maybe you know, people would think there was a trunk laying in the gutter because he never knew when he was going to have one of those spells. Well, he had an attack and died during World War II when all of his sons were in. All three of his sons were in the service, and he was. He'd always get up every morning and he'd make coffee and Claire had come down. She lived at home, and she said came down and she said the coffee wasn't made or anything, and she said, "Hey, Pa!" She knocked on his room door, and he didn't answer. So she opened the door and looked in, and there he was kneeling by his bed with his head down on the bed, and he was dead. He died on his knees saying his prayers. He must have felt a heart attack coming on, and he died on his knees saying his
You
prayers.
think it was in the morning or in the evening?
In the morning.
He got up to say his morning prayers.
Yes, and he died on
What
his
a
knees.
trip.
Well, you gotta
Hey,
go.
but you said they tried to set him up in a little store down the street, but it failed.
Yeah, it wasn't successful. It wasn't
Well, it's a
successful.
shame that the police department shunned him.
Well, you know, in those days, they didn't have, like, if somebody got hurt in the line of duty, that they'd have money. That family well, almost starved to death because, they didn't have anything. And for, the kids were little and Grandma Duffy couldn't go out to work. And so, gosh, the kids would have paper routes and go and sweep out stores, shovel sidewalks, different anything to bring in a little money. And it just seemed like, I don't know what I was leading up to.
That they just didn't have any money and they almost starved to death, you were saying?
Yeah, let's see, I forget now what I was trying to say. But finally, there was a sheriff in Austin that he knew all about the situation and he kept trying to get some help for them. And so there wasn't anything, at that time they never had compensation for a policeman in the line of duty. So he put Grandma Duffy's name up as police matron. And they awarded her the job of police matron, and she was a police matron and made good money for the rest of, as long as she lived until she retired. I think she was in her 70s. She was a police matron. And they used to have a joke, Bob's friends would call up, and one of them, Larry Dano, called up one night and he said, Mrs. Duffy, do you save bad girls? And she said, I try to, Larry. He said, well, save me one for Saturday night.
Good for her.
Yeah, she all used to laugh at that. And Larry Dano and Bob were, best friends.
I remember them.
Yeah. Anyway, Larry Dano's and Bob would get in a fight once in a while, and Bob would say, your mother's nothing but a little thin woman. He'd say when they'd get mad, he couldn't think of anything bad to say
About Mrs. Duffy?
about
Mrs.
Larry
Mrs.
Dano.
Dano, your mother's nothing but a thin woman?
Nothing but a little thin woman.
That would be a put down, huh?
Yeah, that was a put down.
That's a
Well,
Bob
anyway,
put-down.
enough of that, but I will tell you this much, that when the first Valentine's Day when we were in 8th grade, in the Catholic school it was alphabetical, A, B, C, D, well, Duffy, and then Engel, so I sat right behind Bob in 8th grade. Well, and Bob's sister, always heard him come home, and it's all he talked about is Georgianna Engel, Georgianna Engel. So she put a penny chicken dinner, they used to have little candy bars for a penny like now.
Yeah.
And she wrapped it up and she put to Georgianna Engel from Robert Duffy, and she put it in the Valentine box. Well, I tapped him on the shoulder and I said, oh, thank you for the Valentine. That was really thoughtful of you to give me a little candy bar. Well, how come you didn't give me one, says the rest of the girls. And he didn't know anything about it. He says, my mother had a locked Ruth in the bathroom for 2 days before whenever I was home. I was going to beat her up. But one year he sent me a Valentine, and on the Valentine he said, he put on there, to think it all started with the penny chicken dinner.
I think that's in the Rockwell book that he has, he signed the inscription to think it all started with the penny chicken dinner.
That's what he
And
said.
he put a heart
It all
through it.
started. Well, we never dated, ever. He went to the public high school, and I went to the Catholic high school because it was very expensive to, for those days, it was during the Depression, that a lot of people his mother couldn't afford to send him to Catholic high school, so he went to the public school, and so I think I was about 20, 21. The fact of the matter is, when he brought me home from the first date that I had with him, I said, well, I'm 21 years old now, today was my birthday.
Wow,
He didn't know it,
You didn't know it was your birthday. You went out on your first date on your birthday.
Yeah,
Well, now, what was your childhood like? Now, your father came from a very poor background where he never got more than a 4th grade education.
He never got more than a 4th grade education, but he was very, very successful as a butter maker.
Creamery.
When he had a creamery in a place called Pratt. In Pratt, he won, I think 10 years straight. He won champion butter maker of the state of Minnesota. You know, they take a sample to the state fair. Well, then entered a sample of his butter in the national contest, and he was world champion butter maker one year.
Wow.
And then he quit doing it, entering, because all the other butter makers, different ones around the small places, were jealous, and they, you know, like he got accused that he was making that butter just, you know, in a small thing and turning it in, you know. But he'd take that right out of the big vat that he made, you know, that's what everybody got, that's what the kind of butter. He lived in a place where he had good farmers. They brought in their cream every day, where some of them, you know, would keep it for a day or two and it wouldn't be sweet cream. Well, his butter was all nice sweet cream butter that he made. Well, then he moved from this small little town of Pratt and to Blooming Prairie, Minnesota, and that's where the last two of us were born. I was born in Blooming Prairie, and Bernadine was born in Blooming Prairie.
You're the younger of the two. You're the
Uh-huh.
baby of the family?
I was the youngest. And then when I was about in the first grade, you know, my dad, when we lived in Blooming Prairie, he always, you know, always liked bees. And he got a hive of bees and got started from one of my uncles. And then he ended up, I don't know how many colonies he had, maybe 50 colonies of bees that he had. And he used to make so much money on his bees, you know, the honey, he had an extractor and everything. He made so much money on that lots of times he'd get his check from the creamery and he'd just stick it in his pocket or his billfold and he wouldn't cash it. And finally the secretary at the creamery would say, well, John, you're following up all my book work. He says, you got to cash that check. I mean, you know, he didn't need it.
Oh my God.
And so, anyway, for some reason or other, I don't know, I can't remember just exactly why we moved from Blooming Prairie to Brownsdale, but there was some kind of something came up and my dad didn't like it, and so he just quit. And he heard about this job in Brownsdale where the butter maker was ill. And so they asked him, they just begged him if he wouldn't please come over and take over the creamery there just to run it until the man was well. Well, everything went so well when my dad was running it that they asked him to stay, and he said, I can't do that. He said, I can't take a man's job because he's sick. Well, we're going to let him go anyway. We're going to let him go anyway. See, it was a farmers cooperative creamery and they wanted my dad. So finally they talked him into it, and he had 2 helpers in that creamery, and then he had a secretary in the office. And he ran that creamery for a good many years. But when he first came there weren't very many Catholic families in that town, and I think there might have been 1 or 2 other families that were Catholic, and we were the only ones. And he had 2 helpers in there that were kind of slovenly, and my dad was very meticulous and fussy. He wanted everything just so, and so he told him, he said, you know, you'll have to shape up. He was getting after him and so forth, and they got so mad at him, and they said, well, you're just nothing but a darn Catholic. You just think you can run the whole town. You know, and my dad says, I'm not trying to run the town, but I am running this creamery, and you're fired. And that's how he got rid of one of the helpers that were a pain in the butt. as a result, my dad was buttermaker for 20 years in that town of Brownsdale. And so Bernadine and I more or less, grew up there. But Emily and Eldon both had graduated from high school in Blooming Prairie before we moved to Brownsdale. And so Don and Bernadine used to drive back and forth together to Austin High School. Dad gave them a car and they'd drive back and forth. And then when...
And what year was this when they were in high school? Was this around the time of the Depression?
Yeah, well, was 1931 to 1933 or something like that. Emily went to Winona State Teachers College while we lived there. She didn't live in Brownsdale at all. She graduated from high school and then she went almost directly, to college. And Eldon, he took a notion to be a butter maker, and he worked with my dad in the creamery. And both of my brothers learned the butter maker trade from my dad, and they turned out that both of them were butter makers. So that's the way that worked. But
did your dad ever do any cooking at home? Did he?
No.
Your mom handled all the cooking?
My mom ran the house. She disciplined the family. She disciplined the children. My dad never raised a finger to one of us that I know of or ever saw. He was a loving, devoted man that you can't believe I've never seen the likes of since. He just lived for his family, and he couldn't do enough for us. I never left the house. When I went to high school, I never left the house a day that he didn't say, "Do you need any money? You want some money?" I didn't know there was a depression because he had this good job in the creamery. He got a check every month, and my mother was a good manager. I never knew there was such a thing as depression. We always had money. We always had every 2-3 years a new car. And so anyway, as a result, Dad ran that creamery all those years, and that's where he died, in Brownsdale. He had a heart attack. It was during World War II that he came home, and early in the morning, it must have been about 7:30 or 8 o'clock, my mother was washing clothes. Bernadine and I were living there with Mom and Dad. She had Maureen, and I had Michael. And it was while the boys were overseas, Ike and Bob. And he came staggering in the house and he said, "I'm having a heart attack, I'm having a heart attack." And I ran and hollered for my mother and I said, "Lay down on the Davenport, what can I give you?" And I ran to the telephone right away, and the first thing I did was call a priest. I want to call a priest. And he says, no, I'll be all right, And I'd already dialed, and I got Father Corcoran on the line, and I said, "I think my dad's having a heart attack. Can you come?" And Austin was 10 miles away. Well, I hardly got the phone hung up, and he was there. That 10 miles, he must have broke all the speed limits, and he came and gave Dad all the last rites, but he kind of came out of it. And so I also called the doctor from Austin to come down there, and he came, and he got there after the priests and everything, and he wanted to take him to the hospital, and my dad says, "No, I don't want to go. I'm going to be all right." And then he told all of us, he said, "No, he needs to go to the hospital. He really needs to go to the hospital." So Emily at that time was living with Bill Howley, and she was out visiting. That was it. She was out visiting Bill Howley. He was stationed at the Pentagon, and he had gone in service, and he was stationed at the Pentagon. And Marilyn and Kathleen were out there too. And I remember when the priest walked in, there was one of either Marilyn or Kathleen, I think it was Kathleen, was scooting around on one of those little potties around on the kitchen floor. And we had, you know, it was all a state of confusion. Here I was taking care of those two babies. Bernine was working at the hormone packing plant, and you know, Mom and I took care of those. But my dad, that was one of the happiest last years of his life because he just adored Michael and Maureen. And I mean, every single day when he'd get home, he'd put them in the buggy and take them for a walk. Well, he put
You mean the baby thing? The baby buggy, you mean?
Yeah, the baby buggy. And
Michael in the front, you said?
yeah, Michael was in the front, and I said to him, I don't know. He says, I said, how come you got Michael's always in the front and Maureen's towards the back? He says, well, I turn around and push the other way. It was one where there's a
There are handles on both
handlebar
sides.
on either end. And but he says, you know, he says, I love that little boy so much. He says, I like to look at him all the time. I'm serious.
That's sweet.
I said, I never told Bernine that. She'd feel bad. But Maureen was just adorable. There was those two little kids in the playpen.
But Mike was cute.
And there was only 3 months difference in their age. Maureen was 3 months older than Michael. But my dad had him on his lap every night. He'd rock him, you know.
So he lived after his heart attack a year, you thought you said?
No. After his heart attack, he only lived 3 days.
Oh,
Okay.
Wow.
3
God
days.
bless him.
Yeah.
Did he die in bed in his sleep, or
No,
did he
we
have another massive heart attack?
took him to the hospital in Austin. We had the ambulance come and take him. He didn't want to go. When he drove away, we could see him looking out the window, looking where he was leaving from, because he knew he wouldn't be coming back.
Oh.
Wow.
Yeah, he knew he wouldn't.
You would have rather died at home, I bet.
Yes, he would have rather died at home. That's right. But that was a wonderful man, and I'll never forget him as long as I live. You know what I mean?
Oh, what a
He was such a
sweetheart.
good father.
He obviously did a lot with his fourth grade education to be so successful.
Oh, he was.
When he worked with the bees, did he? I mean, did he ever get stung or?
No,
what was it
he
like?
had all the preparation, you know, that, of course he'd get stung, but, you know, they get immune to it after a while.
Yes,
you know,
they do.
when they get stung so many times. But he always had all the paraphernalia that you put on your head, and the smoker, you know, you squeeze it when the smoke comes out to scare the bees away when he pull hives, what do you call
The cone.
the cones out of the hives. And
Did you ever
stuff
go
like
and watch him do it and help him?
I used to go down there, but then I got stung a few times.
So you stayed away.
Yeah. So my dad used to keep some of his beads behind the priest's house there in Blooming Prairie, and so my dad wasn't a Catholic, and I always saw to it that we'd get to church, and so.
What was his background if he wasn't Catholic?
Nothing.
Nothing, I guess.
Because he didn't live
Anyway, he became friends of the priest then, because, you know, he'd go down there to tend his bees behind the priest's house. He let him in a field behind there. This was a small town. And Father Donovan was his name. He took a liking to Dad, and he says, John, he says, you go to take that family to church every Sunday. He says, don't you think you ought to join them? He says, don't you think you ought to? And he gave them instructions to become a Catholic, and didn't tell my mother anything about it or anything. And then on Easter Sunday, he got up and went to communion with the rest of us. And that's
how
but
sweet.
he'd go to church
He'd
with
go to
us.
church and sit in the pew and
Yeah,
everything.
he'd go, but he just never, you know, joined as far as, you know, taking the sacraments, and so so when he died, we located where Father Donovan was, and he came and was on the altar with the other priests there. There were 3 priests on the altar at my dad's
Wow.
mass. You know, the Father anyway, that's the story of it.
Oh,
my
how
dad.
sweet.
Yeah, I graduated from high school at St. Augustine, and Bernadine and I both, the Catholic high school. We both graduated from there, and I went on. Bernadine didn't go to college. She wanted to be get in the Hormel office. She wanted to do office work, and so she kept applying, and they were just, not hiring, and she got disappointed, and so finally one of the guys from, there was kind of a big shop over the Hormel packing plant, my dad saw him at church one day, and he says, well, my daughter Bernadine goes over there all the time, puts in her application, and is there anything you could do to help her to get a job? The next week they called her up and hired her.
Old Joe had a pull.
Yeah, he did help. He was a big shot, that guy that Dad asked. Anyway, she got on there, and she learned how to be a comptometer, and that's how she worked, running a comptometer when she helped put Ike through
Medical school?
his osteopathic college. Yeah, he went to the College of Osteopathy. Yeah, he's an osteopathic doctor. Ike was.
Yeah, I was thinking Bill Holly worked for Hormel, but Mom was saying the other night he worked.
No,
Yeah.
Bill Holly, Emily's husband, he and his brother owned a lumber yard. They started it. They borrowed some money from their mother, and they started this lumber yard, and worked, the two of them, and they built it up to one of the biggest in the city of Austin. And when Emily was going to college, or one of her last years, she used to go to dances with Eldon. He'd take her to all the dances, any dance she wanted to go. He loved his sister. They were just a year apart, and every place that he'd go. But he liked him to go along, because then they'd drive home and he could get beard up,
That's
So-
Emily and Uncle Red.
Mhm.
And they were good buddies.
Yeah, and that's where she met Bill Holly at some dance that she was with Red. They go to dance together, and then he'd let her do, dance with anybody. And they were people. A lot of times when they go to church, they thought they were a married couple, because we were a big family. There were 5 of us kids. We didn't all fit in the pew. Well, they'd sit by themselves, those 2 oldest ones. So, anyway. But that's it. That's how she met Bill Holly, and, a lot of the people that set their cap for him, because he was quite a catch.
Meeting Uncle Red.
No, Bill Holly.
Bill Holly,
Holly, okay.
yeah, he was quite a
He had a
catch.
lot of money.
What was how did he get his money?
Made it in the lumber yard, he and his brother.
Oh, they ran the lumber yard.
They owned it. Yeah,
Owned
they
them.
owned it. It was a big lumber yard. And Austin was a town where there was a lot of building because of the Hormel packing plant, and they started it, and and they sold it about right after World War II, just a few years after that. I think Bill was in his early 50s, and he retired, and he never made so much from that he didn't have to work again. And they sold that lumber yard.
Wow.
He and his brother.
Now, tell me about your mother. What was her background? Did she come from money or no money?
No, my grandfather, Duesbavick, was a rich farmer. He had several farms and stuff. He had a family of 10 children. There were 3 boys and 7 girls. That's 10, isn't it? Yeah. And it seems like the oldest was a boy, and then there was all those girls, and then the last 2 were boys. Well, he'd have those girls out in the field, and they'd have to work just like a man, my mother said, and anyway, that's the story of my mother.
How did she meet your father?
I told you she met my dad when she went over to visit her sister, who whose husband owned a farm there at Medford, or where, and that's where,
Was that Ovina, her sister?
yeah, Ann Elvina was her. She had,
I always loved Elvina.
yeah. So that was the story there. So anyway, then, you know, I was during World War II. Then Bob, he decided to get married. My folks just had a fit. They just had a fit because they were afraid that, you know, Bob would be killed and I'd be left a widow and so forth. And so they kind of objected to it. And I remember Bob came home on leave and I said, well, you got to ask my dad if you want to get engaged and get married and that. And so he said to my dad, what would you think if Georgie and I got married? My dad took one look at him, and he was standing in the hallway to go upstairs to go to bed. He turned around and he looked at him and he says, not much. That was the answer he got
Sounds
from
like
my
Bob.
dad. Not much. What would you think? Well, he didn't want me to get, not that he didn't like Bob. It was the fact that he was afraid I'd be left a widow. Well, then we decided to get married. He was alerted to go overseas, and he says, well, I'm not going to go overseas and then get a Dear John letter saying that you found somebody else. He said, I want to get married before I have to ship out. Well, so then I said, well, I don't know. I don't see how we can accomplish that. I was working first when I first got out of beauty school. I worked in a beauty shop for a while, and there wasn't much money in it. And so then I transferred over to work during the war in the ration office, and I made good money there. And anyway,
What did you do in the ration office?
well, the people come in for coupons for gas and for sugar and for meat and things like that, butter. You know, you had to get a ration coupon before you could go and buy it if you had the money to buy it. That was during the war. So anyway, finally, well, Bob said, well, I can't get a leave, but well, then we get married down there in Missouri, where he was a glider pilot. By that time, you know, first he went in the infantry, and he transferred to the Air Corps, and from the Air Corps, he went to pilot's training, and when he was in pilot's training, he went up, and you know, he knew how to fly. He was one of the first people that learned how to fly in Austin. He and Dana were out at that airport, the little airport there in Austin all the time. They all had their private license, and they were all good pilots. Well, when he transferred to in the Army Air Corps, you know, it was just like a lark. He already knew how to fly, and they just went up to have fun. But they had certain little maneuvers and he blamed his instructor for not telling him the rules that you had to follow. You know, a certain way they wanted you to do it, even though my dad could do it. You know, he was a good pilot. So as a result, when he had his final check, he flunked out, and that just broke his heart. And it was not his fault. It was the technicalities of the way they wanted it done. This guy, because Bob knew how to do everything, he just didn't tell, you know, the exact order how they wanted it. When they got down and he found out that, you know, that they didn't pass him or something, he just almost cried. Bob said he was brokenhearted. He said, "It's not your fault, it's my fault." He said, "It's my fault." He said, "You're one of the best pilots." But anyway.
Well, didn't they need him during the war? Why the hell did they let that stand?
Well, anyway, so that's what happened and, to him then. So he still wanted to be a pilot, so he went to the gliders. He found out about the glider pilots. So he went there, and of course he made it there. You know, he had to go through the flight training again and all. Of course, they knew what to do then. And he became a glider pilot. And that's where he was. He was stationed in Sedalia, Missouri at, Knobnoster, Missouri is the name of the place where the airport was, the Army airfield there. And that's where we were married in Sedalia, which is close to Knobnoster. And my dad and my mother, and I think Dorothy Ingle and Grandma Duffy and Claire and let's see, Vernon Ike. He was working as a doctor in some small town there, and I think it was Hillsboro, Kansas, or something like that, where he was. And he came. I guess he got drafted, or he had to go in the service, and so it was just at that time when we were getting married that he came home and over to my wedding in Sedalia, he and Vernon, and that wasn't too far away. And then they drove back with my mom and dad. Nobody could get gas, but the people at the ration office gave me a whole book of stamps so we could drive to my wedding. That was my wedding present. They gave us a whole book of stamps, so we had enough money enough stamps to buy gas to go down there. You know, we drove all the way down to Sedalia, and of course, then a week after we had a nice wedding that Bob didn't want to have anything to do with the Army as far as our wedding was concerned. He didn't want to get married at the base or anything, so he went to the Catholic Church in Sedalia, Missouri, and talked to the priest and said, you know, that I was coming there, but my folks and we were gonna get married. Could we get married in this church there? And he said, would you like to have the chaplain from the base come in and marry you? He says, no, Father, he says, I'd like you to. I don't want any part of the Army connected to my wedding, he said. And it turns out the chaplain became our best friend. That was Father Whalen. Really? And he always could have kicked himself that he didn't have Father Whalen.
Oh, Father Whalen was the Army chaplain.
He was the chaplain there at that base in Missouri. Well, we got married, and that priest, he's so nice. Well, we thought, well, heck, it was just, I had a nice long dress and everything to get married in, and my folks tried to make it nice. We had a wedding breakfast at the hotel there and everything. And then we just said, oh, you don't need a fuss with anything for flowers, because, you know, it's just, you know, just us, 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 people. I don't think there was more than a dozen people at my wedding. And anyway, the priest went and got flowers and had the whole altar decorated up. He told the people, he said, this is the people from out at the base, and we want it nice for them. And you know, then my dad tried to pay it. No, they wanted to do it for us, so they take. So then that was the wedding. Well, then we had a small honeymoon there for 3 days, a weekend in Sedalia, and then Bob had to go over to Knobnoster. Well, he didn't have a car, so we got on the train to go to Knobnoster, which was maybe 25, 50 miles from Sedalia, Missouri, where we're married. And we had rented he had rented a place. There was 3 Army fellows. One of them, the Johnsons, you remember Elmer and Eileen Johnson, and then the Creasy's, E.T. and Mary Creasy. Well, the three of us rented a house from this old couple. Well, they let us each have a bedroom and the kitchen and the dining room. And they had the living room and their bedroom, and that's how they rented their house out to make money during the war. And so you couldn't find any place to live because that's how we were. So anyway, the boys would line up, go to work, and all ride together out to the base every day. And then a week after we were married, Bob and Elmer and two other fellows were on a night flight, and Elmer Johnson was flying, and the other one was Joanne. Oh gosh, I can't think of it. Anyway, this other couple that.
Your other roommate?
No, I can't think of their name, but anyway, it'll come to me what their name was. Isn't that awful? I'm getting old.
I don't know them anyway,
remember their
You
name.
can take it and
okay.
splice it in later, Mom.
Yeah,
You
don't
can
worry about
splice it in.
Yeah. Anyway,
So what about them? They were on a night flight?
and they were on this night flight, and Elmer was flying, and there was one young kid that was, he wasn't a glider pilot. There were 3 glider pilots in that plane because they had to do so many flights where they fly along to observe or watch how somebody was doing things. And so they cut loose from the plane that was towing them, and Elmer was flying, and he went into a dive. That's how they do. They dive and then they glide, and he went into a dive, and Bob and the other guy said, pull it out, pull it out, pull it out. No, in other words, pull up, pull up. Instead, he dove right into the ground. Well, the young boy that was in the back was killed, and his Bob, what's his name, Elmer was pretty well not hurt. His leg was broken, something else was broken, and what's his name, the other guy, Gordon, I can't say what his last is, Hooten, Gordon Hooten, that was his name. He had his jaw broken and something else, but Bob just was shook up. And they called up from the hospital, the base hospital, and they said, Mrs. Duffy, there's been an accident, and your husband and Mrs. Johnson and then you should come right now, come out to the base, and they were hurt. And so, heavens, I didn't know how Eileen could drive, and so they had a car, so we drove out to the base, and then Bob's Father Willen was walking up and down the hall praying for this soldier that he was dying, and that's when Bob wrote that article, God is my co-pilot, or whatever that one that he wrote, that was in the Sunday Visitor. He wrote that at that time about him, telling that, how Father Willen was. And Father Willen was a good friend of ours for years. We'd hear from him every year. And
Did he eventually, is he still living?
oh no, he died a long time ago. He died.
But that poor young boy died, and it was because the other guy just made a mistake.
Yep, he made it. Bob says that was, and so then Elmer and Eileen got out of service because,
He had a broken leg.
his leg was so badly broken that, what I mean, he couldn't fly anymore, and he wasn't suitable for sent overseas or anything. They were alerted to go overseas.
But he got money for that broken leg.
Well, I guess he did. He made out like a bandit.
And Grandpa went
And he
over.
huh?
I'm sorry. And Grandpa went over to England. Then.
Oh yeah. When Bob, we lived together for I don't know, we had about 7 or 8 or 9 months that we were together before he had to go overseas. We transferred from where that accident happened to Louisville, Kentucky. And that's when they discovered that he had, what do you call it, colorblind. He was colorblind. And he'd been fudging, and the guys that gave him the test all the time would pass him, and tell him what, so he could get through. He could match colors, but he couldn't pass the Ishihara test, whatever test that was that they had, to test for being colorblind. He could pick out colors, but there was some kind of a test. So anyway, we were married only a few months, and he got grounded, and that was a big blow because that $90 a month flight pay that he used to get was a big loss, And so anyway, that's.
Did you know the boy who died?
No, didn't know him at all, and Bob and the other ones hardly knew him. He was just a private.
His number was up.
His number was up. That's right. His
How
number
sad.
was up, and that was sad.
But, yeah, he, basically those guys got out, Dad went over, he again had to, we start a new career really in the service.
Well, then when he was made, I think a supply officer, when he couldn't fly anymore, and the glider pilots had a designation of being they were called flight officers. They were not called, second lieutenant or first lieutenant or everything. They were glider pilot and flight officers, I guess that's what they call them. They had a different designation. So anyway, then
Dad lost that.
yes, he lost. I'm trying to tell you about what happened then after that. Oh, we stayed there in Louisville, and then it was he was alerted that he was supposed to go overseas, and they were to be sent to England, and then over into the theater of war. And so then I had to go home, and I remember he put me on the plane. On the train, and he got me one of those little compartments, and it wasn't like, and I went home on the train, and then he was alerted to go overseas. Well, then it turns out that some way or another, they were put off being sent over, and they were sent back to North Carolina or someplace in North Carolina. When just before they went overseas, and that's where he was when Michael was born. He was, and the funny part of it is, it was not too far from where Michael ended up when he was what do you call it, paratrooper in North Carolina, and that's where he met Patty. He went to the university while he was, there.
Greensboro?
Yeah, I don't know what it was, and that's where he met Patty because he took classes, when he was in service, That's where he met Patty. But the irony of it is that he was stationed in that.
Not far from where he was
Not
born.
far from where.
Dad was when he was born.
Yeah, that's right. When he was born.
So Dad didn't get to see Mike? He didn't get to see him?
He was alerted to go overseas, and when I had Michael, they wouldn't let him come home because he was alerted to go overseas. Well, that's when Bob's dad died. I remember I came home from the hospital 10 days. They made you stay in bed for 10 days in those days.
Smart move.
Yeah, anyway, I said, well, I'm not going to go back to Brownsdale without Grandpa Duffy seeing Michael, because I said, you know, that's 10 miles and they don't have a car. Well, let's stop over at Duffy's and show Grandpa Duffy his new grandson. And we went over there, and he didn't want to come out. I don't know whether he was embarrassed or what it was. He didn't want to come out to the car. And so he never saw Michael.
You never saw Michael?
He never saw Michael, and then just a few days later, that's when he died. And he could have seen Michael. Michael was named, he knew Michael was named after him. And he says, they told him, they said, Michael's named after you, Joe. And he says, no, he's named after his grandpa, Ingle. And no, it's Michael John Duffy. That's what his name is. And, you know, so he was named after both of his grandparents.
Which one was Michael?
Grandpa Duffy's name was Michael Joseph Duffy.
Oh.
And they always called him Joe.
Right.
And John Ingle, okay.
Yeah, John Ingle. And he says, oh no, he wasn't named after me. He was named after Grandpa Ingle. He didn't want to take that honor. But that's how Bob got to see Michael, because he came home for his dad's funeral, and he went back to the base after he was home for 10 days, for his dad's funeral. They gave him 10 days off. And then he was sent overseas, and he landed in England on our wedding anniversary. And when he was home, he had Claire to send me a dozen roses. He ordered them, and a white orchid, because I carried a white orchid on my prayer book to send to me on my first anniversary. But he landed in England, ironically, on our first anniversary, and he was stationed in England, maybe 7 or 8 months. And then he was sent over after D-Day, over to what do you call it, France.
Right.
Yeah, and that's where he was in France and Germany. He just followed because he was behind the lines. He was the supply officer in charge of all the supplies and so forth. So he wasn't on the front lines, but he said he flew quite a few missions that he just wanted to see what it was like. Now, wasn't that stupid of him to get up in those bombers and just fly along like that kid that got killed?
He would go up with the guys just for nothing.
Yeah, he didn't have to go, but he'd go.
In the Flying Fortresses,
Just to see when they fly over for those missions, or when they drop bombs and stuff. So, but anyway, he was stationed there. So that's the story on that. Well, what else do you want to know?
So when did he come home from the service?
He was, it was when the war was over, it was 1945, wasn't it? I think. All right. Well, he came home that summer in the summer sometime, and he was then alerted after he came home from the European theater that he was have to go over to the Japanese theater, because the war wasn't over in Japan. It was just over. And while he was home there on a month's leave, because, from being over in Europe, then that's when they attacked, they dropped the bomb and then the war was over. So then he never had to go back. He was discharged. I don't know whether he had to report back to get his things and to turn in stuff. But he tried to turn in, he had a parachute. I don't know how he ended up with it, but they used to have to turn him in. But when he came back from the war, you couldn't find a place to live. we had to live, we lived with my mother for a little while, and then somehow or another, the man that owned the place wanted it for one of his relatives. They didn't build any homes or apartments or anything during the war.
And what about
Wow.
Aunt Emily was so wealthy? Oh,
Just for a moment. This thing's gonna run out in just a moment.
I gotta
So
go potty anyway.
And when you do this, Mom, your face looks funny.
What do you mean?
You're
It's
doing
all right.
this.
But that's okay, because we can take the camera off.